Hello everyone! All the birds have just started popping off, so if you can hear them in the background, which you probably can because they're Australian birds and Australian birds are, they make their presence known. So I thought today what we would do is do another catch up on what I've been reading. When we last caught up on what I was reading, I was in a bit of a reading slump, and at the start of what I was reading I guess you'll kind of see that again. And then I read some okay books, and then I read some really good books which I'm very excited to be able to talk about. So with no delay I will hop right into it. So when we last caught up I was reading Silas Marner by George Eliot. If you watch my last video about going to the book exchange, you'll see that I took that book to the book exchange. I am a big believer that there are too many books in this world that I want to read and not enough time to read them all. And I think especially with classics it's important to remember that, because I feel like when you start to read a classic there's a little bit of pressure where if you're not enjoying it, it's almost like I have failed because it's a classic and they are so widely loved and lauded as being well written or having beautiful characters or great plot or touching people in so many different ways. So if you don't vibe with a classic, it can feel a little bit like I'm just a modern girl who doesn't actually know how to read real books. But it's not true, because classics cover so many different types of writing and styles and genres and all these things. So if you're not vibing with a classic, I think you are just as justified to DNF it and say that I didn't like it. I didn't vibe with Silas Marner. When it started I was like, oh, I think this is going to be really good. Like the writing was a tad long-winded but really like lyrical and really beautiful, and was just kind of saying things in a way where it was like, yeah, you're right, but I never would have thought to put it that way. But something that I've discovered from my reading since we last talked about what I've been reading is that I am a very plot-driven goyle. Unless the writing is like super quick and fast-paced, or I'm really personally attached to the characters, I'm not someone who tends to enjoy sitting through books where it's kind of people sitting and talking about things, or really long internal monologues. That's not a rule. I won't say that's always the case, because there are definitely times when I do like that. Oh my gosh. But yeah, I got kind of halfway through this book and it was dragging, and I know so many people love this book but I just wasn't feeling it. So I ended up DNFing it. And then in a couple videos ago I was talking about how I have briefly tried out an Illuminate subscription, because when I was younger watching, you know, videos of people unboxing these beautiful special editions and things felt very unattainable for me, and now that I am working full-time, although it means I can't read as much, it means that that is less unattainable. So I started to read the first book that I received, which I think was the May Illuminate book, which was so beautiful. It is Fathomfolk by Eliza. Just look at this book. I'm just going to quickly show you some of the things that are in this book. The best part of this book is this. Oh, it is so beautiful. So Fathomfolk is I think it's a YA debut fantasy set in this underwater world that's based on kind of all these kind of underwater creatures from different Asian mythologies. There's kind of like a human land and an underwater land where all the Fathomfolk live, and there's kind of like tension between them about who's better and who's not, and the Fathomfolk tend to get treated pretty poorly, and we follow a bunch of different characters who are kind of within that system and making it work for them, or fighting against that system, or just kind of being in the world. This is tricky for me now, because I am someone who, if I don't like a book I don't keep it. I don't see a point to. I have plenty of books that I do like, but this is so beautiful but I didn't like it. I really liked the idea of the story about all these different kind of underwater Asian mythological creatures interacting with each other and having different traits, and seeing, you know, like a dragon, water dragon is like a super like high class one, but then like a kelpie is like not so high class. There was all this kind of political stuff going on, but it just came across quite cliche. I didn't vibe with the writing so much. There were times when it was kind of like a character would be walking down the street and then all of a sudden we would be describing a conversation that was inside one of the buildings, and it wasn't super clear about, you know, that transition from one setting to another. Yeah, the plot started to feel like it was dragging on a little bit and getting a little bit convoluted and being cliche at the same time. I felt like, yeah, I can kind of see where this is going and I'm not super interested in it, which I was really sad about, because I think the other thing as well is that I've done my time with YA fantasy, with YA romance, with that was pretty much all I read from like 14 to 17 and I just don't, that's not what I want from reading anymore. Like, I'm not opposed to it if it's well written and it engages me, hell yeah, I'm ready for that, but I don't particularly go into writing just to have that vibe and that feeling anymore. I do want to read good books whereas before I was able to quite easily look past, like, okay, this isn't a good book, but it's giving me my romance and my fantasy that I want. Okay, then I tried to film a video that failed and I read some things for that. So I tried to film a spin the wheel video where I put every book that I have on a wheel and I was spinning it to pick what I was going to read next. I might do it again in the future. Is that something that you guys are super interested in? But I just found that it could have been just the time that I was trying to do it in was a little bit stressful and I needed to be able to read whatever the heck I wanted to read. It could just be that I am a mood reader and that was something that I discovered about myself, but I did read some things for that, so I'll talk about them. So the first book that I spun on that wheel was The Legends of King Arthur and His Knights, the one by Sir James Knowles. I did actually record what I thought about that book before I gave up on it, so what I'll do is I'll just put her in here now, so if she's making references to wheels and spinny things, then that is why. So I'll let her talk and then you can come back in a sec.
Hello! Please don't mind my hair being wet. So I finished The Legends of King Arthur and His Knights last night. I am glad I've read this because I feel like it's been sitting on my shelf for ages and I like almost picked it up a couple of times and then I didn't, so I'm glad that doing these challenges forced me to actually read it. It reminded me a lot of when I read The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, which I read, I think, last year or the year before. It's a very similar kind of formula of like there's one champion or hero or bowman or knight or prince or king who is the best at everything he does, and he is the best knight in the realm. He's the holiest knight in the realm and only he could do everything, and everyone he encounters he defeats, everyone he encounters has heard of him, wants to fight him, they duel, they forgive each other, and then, you know, they join whatever group it is that we're talking about. So for Robin Hood it was they would come and join the band of merry men, and in this legend it was they go and they join the Knights of the Round Table, or they go and they talk to King Arthur and Queen Guinevere and, you know, pledge loyalty to whoever defeated them. Which is interesting because they're both quite, you know, old and popular and still maintained English folklore and legends, so it's interesting that they kind of follow that together. And that's why I like reading legends and folklore, especially I guess reading multiple from one country, because then you start to get like a sense of like, oh, what was the history of that place like, what it was cool enough and important enough to these people that they were like, oh yeah man, this guy Sir Galahad walking around in the woods defeating people left and right, write that down, let's pass it down 14 centuries, you know. And this particular edition, it did kind of the middle chunk got a little bit repetitive and I found myself getting bored and having to kind of push myself through it a little bit, because we did get the perspective of a few different knights and their adventures, but a lot of it was quite similar, of them literally kind of having a quest, going around in the woods, defeating people, never being defeated, being very honourable. I didn't know that the legend so heavily involved the search for the Holy Grail, and kind of a lot of like Christian symbolism and stories and metaphors and things like that, where it kind of turns towards not being so much about King Arthur and being more about the search for the Holy Grail and more of the Christian kind of symbolism and things. There was a lot of the time where I was going, oh, okay, alright, cool, how did that happen? It started to kind of feel like a fever dream of things that were magical were happening, but it wasn't so much of that kind of like, oh, we live in a magical world. It was kind of like, and then this happened and this is very heavily Christian symbolism, and it doesn't really make sense, but that's kind of the vibe. I didn't feel this so much for the Robin Hood, but I felt like there were some really questionable decisions made in this book, which I guess for a lot of old books, like people chopping off people's heads for no reason and just never thinking about it ever again. But for example, halfway through this book, spoilers I guess, although I don't know if it counts for talking about old legends, Merlin is trapped in a tree by a damsel that he is trying to like seduce, and she doesn't really want to hear about it, she just wants his magic. And Merlin gets trapped in a tree, and the only one who can let him out is the damsel. So he's stuck there, despite the fact that he's Merlin. And someone finds out and goes to King Arthur's court and tells him, and it's literally, he goes, "Oh, what?" And then he's like, "Anyway, the Holy Grail." And we never hear about Merlin again in the whole book, and I was so upset. How could they leave my boy Merlin stuck in a tree after all the shit he did to get Arthur on the throne? And there was also, so at some point in the book, Queen Guinevere calls Lancelot to her chambers while King Arthur is out hunting. And it sounds like they were just having a conversation. It might be implied that they were doing something, but Lancelot's reaction to being discovered was that, "Oh, you know, I've been betrayed, this isn't how it actually is." And King Arthur's first thing is, "Well, guess I have to burn Queen Guinevere at the stake." Like, no discussion, no like, "Hey, what was actually going on? Should we talk about this?" Just straight to the stake. Which I was like, okay. And it felt like a lot of the time, and I guess maybe that speaks to the, like, how old the legend is, that I was questioning the decisions of our main hero characters a lot. Yeah, it did read very much like an old folktale, and I did enjoy getting immersed in that folktale and getting kind of, especially in kind of the language. I don't know if, you know, this language specifically is from 14 centuries ago, but from when it was recorded, how they kind of speak and the way words are organised, especially with the English language, which is the language that I speak, I find it super interesting to see how language has evolved and where, like, certain phrases that we use today might be phrases that they use today just simplified, or we've like dropped off words. So I feel like reading older stories is really good for that. And I also really enjoy, I feel like I'm talking forever about this book, I really enjoy hearing folk or legend explanations for landmarks or old monuments that are in the land that they don't know how got there. And that happened in this book, so they explained in their eyes how Stonehenge came to be. Yeah, just sick. Cool. I really love to read old stories and hear their explanations for how things were.
So that was what I read then, and then the next book that it spun was The Beautiful and the Damned by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Something that I learned about myself also when reading this book is that F. Scott Fitzgerald is an incredible, beautiful writer, and his character studies are so beautiful and intricate, and you feel like, you know, he must be basing his characters on people that he knew in real life, or just have the most incredible realistic imagination whatever existed, because every character that he writes feels so real, and you feel so immersed in the like 1920s New York feeling, glamour. But again, it just wasn't the right time for me for that book. It is not so much like, there's plot, things happen in the story, but it's not so much driven by the plot as it is by the internal workings of the characters and what's kind of going on for them, which was incredibly spectacularly well done. It was just dragging on a bit, I think. And again, I was in a spot where I was a little bit of a stressful period, that period when I was trying to read The Beautiful and the Damned, and coming home and having that book going and being like, I am not in the mood to hear the internal machinations of this New York socialite who is very vapid and just wants to be loved, and this guy who thinks he's better than everybody and wants to be a writer but won't write. Again, very good characters, but not, I wasn't vibing with it. Very psychological, very beautiful. Maybe I will return to it at a different time. Yeah, maybe for me F. Scott Fitzgerald is better in, well, the dogs are popping off. Maybe for me F. Scott Fitzgerald is better in more kind of, in smaller chunks, because I did enjoy The Great Gatsby, and that was a much more condensed piece of work by him. Oh, okay, and then I read probably one of my favourite books this whole year, Sagaland by Richard Fidler and Kari Gislason. If you are someone that has had an Iceland phase, I know so many of you have, or if you are someone who loves Vikings or like the Netflix series or Norse mythology or whatever it is, read this. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh. We follow these two guys, one of them who is born in Iceland and one of them is kind of his friend. I think they're from the ABC. Yeah, the ABC, who's kind of a presenter who likes to research Iceland, and they, oh, They explore all of these stories about the kind of sagas of Iceland's founding. And I didn't know that a lot of people in Iceland can trace their ancestry. Like, they have a kind of center where you can trace yourself back to the people in the sagas, and that is something that they're exploring for Kari Gislason in this book, and it is so engaging, and I loved the voice, and it was sad, and it was poignant, and it was funny, and there was the perfect amount of switch up between telling the stories of the different sagas of the people that lived on the island and telling their stories and what Iceland means to them. It just made Iceland sound like the most beautiful place in the world, just this like quiet, mysterious, hidden little place existing at the top of the world. It tells you about these random amazing things that have gone on in Iceland. Like chess plays a part in this book, and it was perfect. It fit in so well. Yes, if anyone has read this book and can recommend other books that are similar, this kind of like autobiographical, mythological, coming of age mashup of genres, please do. Yeah, I remember finishing this and just being so hungry to consume. I'm sorry if you can hear the dog barking. He agrees with what I'm saying about this. I remember I finished this and I was so hungry to just consume more about the culture. Me and my husband were just watching Iceland montages to see what the lands looked like and picturing like what it would have been like to land there, and oh yeah, absolute 5-star read. Potentially one of my favorite books of this whole year. Not potentially, yes, I love this book so much. And then I finally got around to reading a Bronte that I haven't read yet. So I read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. This copy is a little bit chewed on. I gave it to my mum to read when I was finished because she's the reason that I like the Bronte sisters so much, and she hadn't read this one yet. And her Jack Russell Eddie decided it looked delicious as well. So it's, you know, now it's got a bunch of memories associated with it. This was incredible. This was really, really good. So Tenant of Wildfell Hall, I first heard about as being one of the very first pieces of feminist literature. This was published by Anne Bronte in 1848. So keeping in mind this was published in 1848, we follow these two people, Gilbert and I can't remember what her name is. Helen. Oh gosh, how to describe it? So this mysterious widowed lady and her son move into this rundown hole on a hill called Wildfell Hall, and the whole town is like, who are these people, how did they get here? And Gilbert becomes very close with this lady who is Helen, and we learn a little bit about, from her perspective, the situation that she's come from and the honor system that guided her through that, and just the lot of women, especially very religious and pious women, who believe that once you are married, you're married, and you have a duty to do the best you can by your husband, no matter how poorly your husband does by you. It was a really incredible look into how that worked and what it would have been like to be in that situation. And I'm not sure if it's maybe the first portrayal of domestic violence from a woman's point of view, but it's got to be one of them, especially in white Western culture. Okay, I usually film with the window open because it's nice, but I had to close it because the neighbor's dog just cannot cope with the facts I'm spitting. Okay, when I was talking about Silas, Marner, and some classics are your cup of tea and some classics aren't, and that's okay. This is my cup of tea. It was so easy to read, but it was really beautifully written, and I was so invested in what was going on for Helen and her son, and I wanted to see where it was going to go, and I wanted to know what was going to happen for them, which I feel like a lot of the time when I read classics, maybe because of the culture of the time, there's almost like there's that step back from who they are, and you have to kind of like dig a little bit deeper and think separately from the book to be able to kind of figure out who these people are and what they want from the world. But I was so attached to them, and it's still definitely a story of its time. It doesn't go into any explicit detail or anything that would be too scandalous about what Helen went through, but it says enough. So I very much so recommend this and think it lives up to its reputation. I guess the only thing I could say about it is that I found Gilbert a little bit annoying, but it doesn't affect the book at all because you mainly see things from Helen's point of view, and it's not about him, so it doesn't matter. Oh, and then I read another good book. I love when that happens, when you kind of, I feel like that's such a universal experience of being in a slump and then coming out of it. and just reading like three good books in a row, something like that. Anyway, so the next book I read was What You Are Looking For Is in the Library by Michiko Aoyama. I'll show you what the hardback looks like because I feel like that's the best part. It felt very nice to read, and read it I did. This was one of those books where I was underlining things. So I'm not someone who, I don't so much tab up books, I don't so much kind of highlight things and write things in my books. I tend to just kind of want to sit and read and be with the story. But sometimes I'll read a book where the author will say something and I'll be like, facts. And that needs to be underlined, and this was definitely one of those books. So the premise of this story is that there is this library in, I believe it's like a community centre, where there's this librarian who can recommend you whatever book you need that you didn't know you needed. So we follow a bunch of people who kind of go into the library, maybe asking for something specific, and get what they actually needed. It's also translated fiction, in case you can't tell, so it was originally written in Japanese. It's just a lovely little book, and I found myself kind of tearing up at the end of it. It's a very kind of simple translation, and it's very, very easy to read, which when I started it I was like, oh, is this gonna be a bit plain, a bit like not much to it? But there was. It really hit the spot for where I am in my life right now. It felt like the things that the characters were going through were relevant for, it felt like it was speaking to me about the things that I am thinking about and the crises that I am pondering currently. A lot of the lessons they learn and the conflicts they face are based around like, what's the meaning of life? How do I still find time for my passions? How do I find the space to experience life properly in the really go busy environment that we all kind of live in? Yeah, I found the variety of characters and stories really interesting. There was, you know, a young lady that just left university, there was an old man that was retiring, there was a man in his 30s that hadn't worked since he was really young, and I didn't think that any story in particular dragged on for too long. Let me see if I can find something that I underlined to give you a bit of a vibe. Here's one. Ultimately it's all for the best, that many things don't turn out the way that we hoped. Oh, here's one. While I do believe that it was hard work for my mother to give birth to me, it also took me every ounce of my own strength to endure the extremely difficult process of being born. Imagine what an awful shock it must have been to come into contact with the air for the first time, not knowing where I was. But it's why whenever I feel happy or glad about something, I count my blessings and think to myself, now wasn't that all the effort of being born? Which is kind of a, that's a cut up quote, but yeah, it's good. It's very simple, it's very poignant, I recommend. And then, aha, I finally listened to an audiobook all the way through and enjoyed it. So I listened to the audiobook of Funny Story by Emily Henry. So in my, I think it was like the rapid fire tag or something like that, I talked about how I struggle with audiobooks. I think the first couple that I listened to, I tried to listen to audiobooks of classics and my brain was just like, nope. I would find that I couldn't pay attention enough and I would kind of drift off, and then I would come back and be like, wait, what are we talking about? But if I paid attention too much, I would get a headache. So, and someone actually commented this under that video, which great minds think alike, that I should try stories that are more simple, that are easier to listen to and not kind of throw myself in the deep end as I tend to do. So I did, and it was really enjoyable. Having a book to listen to when I was driving or, you know, doing menial tasks was great. This is my first, I've never read or listened to anything by Emily Henry before. I initially thought it might be a bit like, this is one of those books that's super popular but it's not quite my cup of tea. The writing was very engaging. It read like a 90s rom-com, absolutely. It had a really cool way of kind of imparting information about the characters in a very kind of like underhand, like, oh, now suddenly I know that. I didn't even realize I know that now because it was woven into the writing so well. Yeah, initially it was kind of a similar thing of, it was very simple. So I was kind of going, is this going to be a bit plain? Is there going to be any substance? But then I actually found myself getting quite into the story and the writing and the characters and kind of becoming invested in what they were struggling with. So we follow a librarian whose name I have completely forgotten, who her fiance cheats on her with his female best friend, and then she moves in with the female best friend's boyfriend who was also broken up with, and to kind of like just get back on her feet and cope with what has happened, and then shenanigans happen from there. It definitely had its corny bits. It like a 90s rom-com, there were things where I was like, this is so corny, I love it. but also I got kind of teary at the end, and it kind of got a little bit like poignant and a little bit like, wow, okay, there's like these characters have developed and evolved, and I'm a little bit sentimental for them. It felt very kind of human at the end, and it dealt with some very real and relatable conflicts amidst the kind of 90s rom-com, people falling in love and doing silly stuff that puts them in awkward situations. Also, I'd like to note as well that it felt like from memory, it felt like quite a healthy book. Like it wasn't a romance where I was kind of going like, oh girl, that's not the right choice. That's not very healthy. We're really gonna go for this guy right now, which I really appreciate when romance books aren't toxic. Okay, and then, so I've recently returned from a trip down south, and while I was there I binged the end of the book I was reading last time I talked to you guys, which is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, which is the Mistborn book 1. What did I think about this book? So I have read this book, I think, a very long time ago when I was maybe like 15, so there was a vague recollection but not enough that I remembered actually what was going on. Brandon Sanderson is famous for his magic system. That is the shining star of this book, I think, is how well developed his magic system is, and how well thought out like what you can and can't do is, and the kind of like the categories and who can do what and why they can do that and why they can't do that, which makes for a very believable fantasy world that you can really kind of put yourself into. And I'd be interested to read the rest of the trilogy and see how invested I become in that. I did feel a little bit of a step back from the characters. This was published in 2006, I think. Oh, first published in Great Britain in 2009, so kind of the late 2000s, and it does kind of feel like that a little bit, where I don't know, I felt like I couldn't get very attached to some of the characters because they felt a little bit like caricatures. I felt like it went on for a little bit long for my tastes, and I don't particularly enjoy battle scenes or fight scenes where every move that someone makes is described. I just don't vibe with that so much. I tend to start to get a little bit kind of mixed up and kind of picturing things, and then I get disengaged a little bit, which this book does tend to do, but I know some people do like that, of having like a really good visual of like, okay, now this guy's backflipping and this guy's falling over, and so that's part of this book. Yeah, I thought the plot twist at the end was really good. I thought the characters were quite good. There is a romance in this book that I just didn't. It was one of those ones where I didn't feel it. I'm not a big fan of books where, you know, characters might meet on page 2 or 3 times and then one of them is saying, I'm in love with you. I just don't believe it. And I always kind of do a little internal eye roll when something like that happens. And I know in this book, the characters that fall in love are written to have met more times than we are there with them. But also, I want to be with them. If you're going to tell me that you're in love, then I want to feel it. I want to believe it. And I didn't so much feel that with this. But I would be interested to see how the rest of the series goes, because it felt like this was a book by itself and they defeated the big bad guy. Spoiler, I guess. So I'd be interested to see where else it can go. So we're in a world where we have, they're called the Scar, which is like the lower class kind of normal humans, and then you have the nobility, which are a very small elite class whose ancestors used to be the friends and family of the Lord Ruler, who was kind of like this immortal, godlike ruler of the whole world, who can't be killed and is an absolute tyrant and is very powerful. And it's about how this young girl Vin, who is a Scar thief, gets drawn into a plot by a thief of crews who have been hired by a rebel leader to provide him with an army and help him to overthrow the Final Empire. So those are all the books that I've been reading lately. I thought what I would do, I've just come back from a little bit of a trip that I was talking about where I kind of binged and finished the end of Final Empire. It was so beautiful. It's winter in Australia at the moment, and we went down to the south where there's some beautiful kind of forests and caves. So I thought I would kind of end this video with a little bit of a montage of some of the beautiful things I saw there, because I have noticed a parallel between people that like books and people that like nature. So this is for all of you. Before I let you go, I'll tell you about what I'm currently reading. I am currently reading Bunny by Mona Awad. I'm that far in. For those of you who have read this book, I just finished the chapter where there is chewing. So I'm questioning my life. And I look forward to seeing how this book will evolve and what I will have to talk to you about next time I see you. So please enjoy some peaceful montages of forests and caves in the south of Australia, and I will see you all next time. Have a lovely day.